speakers. Dr. Omar Khan, Director of TASO, the Centre for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes. I hope I said TASO right, and it's not TASO. Omar is a researcher and all-round expert on equality and social mobility, especially as it relates to education and the labour market. He joined TASO in June 2020 and leads its work in widening participation and investigating how to eliminate those pesky equality gaps between students. Previously, he was director at the Runnymede Trust, the Race Equality think tank, and has held multiple advisory posts in his field. I'm very pleased to hand over to Omar to begin his presentation, which is very enigmatically described as latest updates from TASO. As before, please do put your questions in the chat as we go along. I'll be monitoring it, or put your hand up if you'd like to ask your question on screen and video. So over to you, Omar. You're on mute, I think, still.
I'm trying to do too many things at once here. I'm trying to tick the share button and the mic button and the blur button. So anyway, yeah, good morning to you all. Thank you. Yeah, it is a bit enigmatically titled. I was on leave for much of August, so I was unable to give you a newer title. I'm about to share my presentation. Can you see that? Can someone?
Yes, we can see that. Yeah. Thanks, Omar.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's an overview of TASO's work so far. So I know that maybe not all of you are familiar with TASO, but I also know quite a few of you are. So what I wanted to do in this presentation is update you on where we've got to with our work, but also offer some reflections of what we've achieved, but also how we could potentially work with you and others in the sector to deliver on our work further. So in case you don't know, TASO is an independent charity. We were spun out of a consortium that included King's College London and Nottingham Trent University, but we are now an independent charity, and we're part of the UK government's What Works movement. I'll say a bit more as the presentation develops on what we mean by What Works. We're a hub for HE professionals to access research toolkits, evaluation techniques, and more. And our specific focus with those toolkits and resources is to focus on widening participation and improving equality outcomes within the sector. We are funded by the Office for Students from 2019 to 2023. We are in the process of seeking refunding. Our mission and our vision are relatively straightforward. It's to eliminate equality gaps in higher education. And our mission, however, not however so much, is there's a specific way in which TASO approaches that vision, which is through evidence-based practice in higher education. We're not so much a campaigning organization, obviously. We're more focused on research and evaluation and trying to inform practice on the ground, which is one of the reasons it's great to be here today. I wanted to sort of indicate why What Works matters and why we have work to do. So this is, apologies, this is England data only. And this shows over time the gap between the proportion of 19-year-olds who attend higher education by free school meal status. You all probably know that there's a gap between those in England on free school meals and those who are not in receipt of free school meals, as there is everywhere in the world, in fact. In terms of their likelihood to attend university or colleges. And that the good news story, I suppose, is that since 2005, and despite the introduction of fees, which many thought would reduce the participation rates of free school meal children, that the rate of children in receipt of free school meals has indeed increased, and it's increased again this year. So this another year for this graph, which from about 15% in 2005-06 to nearly 30% this year. I think it's at 29% this year. So almost doubling over that period of time. However, at the same time, the progression rate for those not on free school meals has increased from just over 30% to approaching now 50%. So over that same period of time, it's also the case that people not on free school meals have increased their participation rates at this and sort of at the same rate. And the upshot, as you can see from that dotted line, I hope you can see that fairly clearly. That's the gap between the two groups. That line has not moved very much at all. if anything, it's sort of stayed more or less the same over that entire period, which means that while we're having some success in improving the rate of free school meal children going to university, we're not really tackling that gap. So what we're doing now is good, but arguably it's not good enough if we want to eliminate these gaps, or at least start to erode the gap between them. And the final point I think I'd say here is we're in a particularly challenging situation, I think, with cost of living and other reasons that we might think that it's going to be even more challenging, both from the point of view of student the effect on young people's choices, the concern about debt perhaps, but also on universities feeling a squeeze as well, and maybe having less resource to do this work. Our work spans 5 key areas. I think one of the things I wanted to say about our vision of addressing inequalities is there are very many inequalities, unfortunately, in higher education. That was just one of them. We know there's inequalities that students with disabilities experienced, inequalities for Black and minority ethnic students, inequalities in terms of gender. But to split up our work, we divided into themes to try to sort of parse those many inequalities. The first theme is on access, so the effectiveness of widening participation outreach. The second theme focuses more on the student experience, so inequalities while people are at their university. And the third and fourth themes focuses on period after leaving university, so employment, employability, although it also picks up the work that student success teams do towards the end of people's university experience. And the fourth theme is a cross-cutting one that focuses on mental health and disability. Finally, we ourselves do a lot of this evaluation, but we were also established to support the sector, and I'm going to give a quick summary of the evaluation guidance that we provide, because we ourselves obviously are a small team of 10 or 12 to improve research and evaluation in the space of access and participation. We can't do it all. We know there's a lot of people in institutions doing this work, committed to this work, skilled in this work, but could use a bit more support. So we have quite a number of resources to support you and others in the sector to improve the quality of evaluation. So a quick overview of those thematic areas. And theme 1, as I said, is on access and participation. And I am going to go into detail on one of these just to explain a bit further how we go about our work and some interesting findings, which is the summer schools randomized control trial. So I'm not going to say any more about that because I go into a bit detail in a few slides. MIOM is the other theme 1 evaluation that we're running. These are pilot impact evaluations on the efficacy of multi-intervention outreach programs. So multi-intervention means that in a lot of cases, providers are doing more than one activity, multiple activities that often include mentoring, multi-intervention outreach, and mentoring projects. And I think there is a challenge there in how you evaluate projects where you have multiple arms, different activities. Which one of those activities is really doing the work, if any work, to address inequality? So look out for that in the spring. This was raised, I think, by Peter Scott earlier in the day. The recent sort of shift in focus from the Office for Students that higher education providers should focus their widening participation activities on raising academic attainment of school students. So in response to that, we have produced a sort of report to support the sector to understand what actually works, because the sort of area of raising academic attainment is a quite wide one, and different kinds of interventions may be more or less effective in doing so. So we've produced this typology, which you can see below, of the different kinds of activities and indicated what the evidence base is for each of them. At present, the evidence base is actually fairly limited in all areas, but the area that has, I think it's fair to say, the best, it's more international as opposed to evidence in the UK, is tutoring and other academic support. There's good evidence that tutoring disadvantaged students has a strong impact on attainment raising. Tutoring by undergraduates or master's students of secondary school students. That evidence comes from Germany and other countries as well. Turning then to the student experience, so the inequalities that we know that people face inequalities in getting into university, but once they're through the door, there are still inequalities, and we're also doing work to tackle that. Some of you may be familiar with our race equality GAPS project, that is due to be published soon. In fact, my colleague sent me the draft report this morning, so we hope to be publishing that at the end of October on whether reforming the curriculum to make it more diverse helps close race equality attainment gaps or not. Another one that I know you'll be looking out for, but that has got slightly delayed, is the online teaching and learning. So obviously during COVID, providers had to move all of the teaching and learning online. And there's, I think, an interesting question as to whether or not, as in secondary school, that move to online had a negative effect on disadvantaged learners, or as we've heard in some anecdotal and other evidence that, for example, maybe disabled students and commuter students at universities actually found the shift to online teaching and learning beneficial. There may be some evidence that shifting to online teaching and learning actually was a positive in terms of attending to some of these long-standing attainment and student experience gaps. Both of these are soon to be published. Themes 3 and 4 are a little bit more at an early stage in terms of doing the evaluation work. We have, however, published the gap analysis reports for our employment and mental health themes, and the disability report is in draft and should be published in the coming month or two. And we have also invited, we've just invited higher education providers to submit examples of activities they're doing in these areas. So I believe actually the tender for employment and employability is still out until Monday. So if you are interested in working with us on that, you have a bit of time, but not a lot of time. We've also announced where you have a bit more time, a project on sandwich courses. So it's an invitation to tender to work with providers who are doing work on sandwich courses to determine if they're effective, particularly in addressing equality gaps, not just in terms of employability generally. I did want to flag this mental health project, which I was really keen to hear from the previous speaker. We have been funded, and it's relatively early days. This summer, the project kicked off a project looking at what works in terms of tackling mental health, specifically with a focus on tackling inequalities in mental health. We're working with 5 partners on that, including Universities UK, Student Minds, Amashi, Smarten, which is the student research network on mental health, and What Works Wellbeing. And I don't really have an update on that, but I just wanted to flag that that's something that will be progressing in the coming 18 months. The evaluation projects, as I mentioned, this is sort of the 5th arm of our work. We've done some work on survey validation. We know that in terms of assessing whether or not interventions work, that all providers do produce surveys, and I think we want to make sure that those surveys are as robust as possible, that the existing scales, so the questions and the ways in which those questions are asked, are as robust as possible. And we would also think there's a challenge in terms of the fact that different providers use different survey scales. So getting more, I suppose, consensus and agreement on those scales would obviously improve the ability to compare across institution. We've also heard from the sector, and we understand that some of our methods require large sample sizes, and that means that maybe small and specialist providers, institutions with fewer students generally, or indeed some cohorts are just by their nature small, for example, Gypsy Roma traveler students, or in some providers, very relatively few disabled students. And so we've published just recently guidance on how to support causal evaluation with small cohorts, and we've started piloting that guidance with providers, including, in fact, some FE colleges. And we've also produced guidance for the sector on ethics, because we're aware, especially when it comes to institutional research, there are sometimes questions of whether or not, including evaluation activities, whether or not that those research projects need to go through internal university ethics boards, which are often designed for academic research. And so we produced some guidance to support those of you who are having to navigate university ethics boards internally, or whether or not you do need to. And a sort of final summary of our evaluation guidance is we have this kind of framework that allows you to, I think, hopefully support any evaluation you're doing. We have on our website a number of webinars, and look out on our website. Please, register for our monthly newsletter, sign up for that. And we have a toolkit as well, which outlines the different standards of evidence and the different quality of evidence for existing interventions, from financial support to summer schools to other activities to attainment raising. So I wanted to go, I know, sorry, I'm just checking the time. Okay, I'm doing okay. I wanted to highlight the summer schools evaluation because it was a recent report published just a few months ago, and it outlines both how we go about our work, but also I think has some interesting findings that I hope are both interesting to you, but might inform how universities develop and plan their access and participation activities, as well as where you're in England and have to produce access and participation plans. So as I've sort of hinted at, our approach to research is first to do some gaps analysis, then to generate some evidence, and then to review and disseminate. So the gaps analysis in the Theme 1 activity showed that summer schools have fairly indicative but suggestive evidence that summer schools are effective in tackling equality gaps. So in phase 2, we've commissioned a number of providers to work with us to assess whether or not those summer schools are in fact effective. So this is sort of where we've just completed the phase 2 bit of the first phase of the summer schools, and we're now kind of trying to review and disseminate that. I did want to briefly indicate this because some of you may or may not be aware that the OFS has this standards of evidence. We were set up and tasked with improving the quality and extent of type 3 evidence. So this is causality. This is a method which demonstrates that an activity has a causal impact on outcomes for students. And I'll explain that a bit further through the summer school project. I did also, though, want to say that we are not saying that other forms of evidence aren't valuable. And in fact, we ourselves do focus on especially type 2 types of evidence. But the specific role for TASO, in terms of why we were established, was to try to support the sector and to provide ourselves to the sector research activities that demonstrate causality where possible. So what do we currently know? So we know that summer schools are associated with an increase in confidence aspirations. We know that in some cases that increase in confidence / aspirations does lead to further applications and progressions to HE, but limited evidence that provides a causal link. And why is there limited evidence that it provides a causal link? Basically because we aren't sure if the people who go on summer schools are already predisposed towards attending higher education, because obviously to apply for a summer school already indicates some sort of awareness of and interest in attending university. It may also be the case that parents or teachers are promoting those particular students for summer schools, and those students are already those who are more likely to apply in any case. So that the positive finding that we're seeing on summer schools has less to do with the intervention itself and more to do with the unobserved characteristics of those who apply for summer schools in the first place. So we sought to try to disentangle that and figure out, is that true? Or are there other unobservable characteristics, in fact, that are making summer schools actually even more effective because they're targeting students who are very unlikely to attend, right? So we just didn't know that kind of information. So we've worked with a number of university partners. We've worked on pre and post 16 summer schools and the behavioral insights team to help us develop it. The findings I'm about to present to you are actually, it's important to note, from the summer schools that were delivered online during the summer of 2021. We in fact originally wanted to deliver this project in the summer of 2020, but something happened that summer, which meant that there was no in-person or any activities on university campuses in the summer of 2020 due to the pandemic. We then faced the challenge that in 2021, even most universities had decided, in fact, all universities, that they would deliver summer schools, but they were only online. So this is an evaluation of online summer schools. We have chosen, and we've kicked off that project. The summer is obviously past now, to follow this up with some face-to-face comparator data, because obviously you might think that the findings we have for online may be different for face-to-face summer schools. We will have those data, but obviously we've just finished summer 2022, so we won't be producing that research for some time. Right, I think I've already explained this. So what were we measuring? So by measuring that difference in outcomes between those who didn't attend a summer school and those who did, so we then asked providers to randomly allocate some applicants to getting a place and some who didn't get a place, and then compared their responses on the number of outcomes. The primary outcome remains enrollment in HE. However, we don't yet have those data because it was still it was a summer school in last year, and most of the young people have still not enrolled. We will start to get that data coming in from early next year. We also are collecting secondary data on which higher education provider, and we're also these data we do have, which is self-reported applications to higher education and attitudes towards education. So that's what we're reporting. And so this is the report that came out in July. And one of the key findings that I wanted to flag to this group before kind of going to my concluding slides was that one of the challenges, even for our work, was that we found that a very large proportion of those in the control group, i.e. those who didn't get allocated a place at summer schools, already were very, very likely to attend higher education. Sort of 91 to 94% of them already reported that they were really likely to attend higher education. So I think the one conclusion is that makes it methodologically very challenging to find a difference between a control and a treatment group when you already have the control group very likely to attend. But the second issue, and I think is a more, maybe perhaps a more interesting one for this group, but also for the sector more widely, is it does suggest that current Whiting participation activities are targeting those who are already likely to attend. You might even be more critical and say that universities aren't doing enough to target those who really are disadvantaged and who are furthest from applying now. So some lessons learned 1 year on, and I will sort of kind of elaborate a bit on that final point. I haven't really mentioned in this presentation, but it was a challenge setting up a charity during a global pandemic, getting bank accounts, getting a charity commission number, etc. On research and evaluation, as you've heard from the summer schools example, especially with the impact of COVID on delivery, but also even on the issue of who goes into a control and a treatment, the real world is messy, right? So RCTs and QEDs were often designed in the medical field, for example, when developing the vaccines for the coronavirus. But in the real world, especially when dealing with humans and social science and educational inequalities, it's a bit messier. But we have found that it is possible to deliver RCTs and QEDs, and so we think that's a very important and positive finding. We do need to be flexible and responsive, especially where delivery changes as it did for summer schools. And I think we are trying to be as sort of responsive as we can to the fact that there is quite a variety of institutional diversity in the UK and, of course, in Ireland and across the world in terms of the different kinds of institutions and the different kinds of policy environments, even within the UK itself. The other, I think, important finding, and we see it in our online learning, but also, as I said, in the summer schools, is this move to online, I think, will have wider and long-lasting implications for higher education as in society. But I think while some of those may exacerbate existing inequalities, there are opportunities, I think, to address inequality. So I think we should think more in our planning for the future. The move to online is actually an opportunity here to address inequalities that haven't moved as much as we would like, alongside the risk, of course, of exacerbating existing ones. For example, less the cost of living crisis to making inequalities of access to, say, digital technology and even laptops even worse. The next point here is that inequalities are persistent and extensive. So I think this is the other challenge, that there are lots of different kinds of inequalities, whether that's types of students, types of universities, but they also vary quite substantially. So we're doing some work, as I said, on the race equality gap, but if you look at that race equality gap, it varies quite a lot for, say, Black students and Chinese students. These inequalities vary by institution, by geography. The final point here, and it leads on to my final slide, is that partnerships are vital for our success. We don't actually deliver these interventions. Universities deliver them. We work with you to support the evaluation of activities that you are already doing. And that particularly requires in-house research and evaluation expertise within those universities. We need to be able to work with you to understand what that intervention looks like so that we can help you and support you in designing the best possible evaluation. And I think this was a sort of final slide to prompt, how can we work better with planners and with planning. We have so far worked more with access and participation teams, and I think it was Peter Scott who mentioned that there is a question of how far those access and participation teams could work more with planning teams. We work a lot with evaluators, especially for theme 1. As I said, our summer school project, and indeed the focus on attainment raising, perhaps indicate that access activities may need to reach newer cohorts and be differently designed. And this, of course, will have an impact on allocation of budgets, on how we design what the activities of access and participation teams are, potentially even on access and participation plans, what kinds of targets and activities the OFS may be looking for in the future. We do work also with student success teams as well as those working on employability, disability, and mental health. And I think one of the reasons I'm highlighting all these different all these different stakeholders is it is a challenge for us in terms of thinking about planning and ensuring that evaluation is part of that planning, that there's many different decision makers and stakeholders here. There's senior leaders. I spoke yesterday at the UUK conference, and it's making sure that they prioritize evaluation as well as widening participation, and to highlight the sort of importance of our work in supporting them and universities generally to deliver regulatory requirements, but also ultimately to improve student outcomes, right? That's the key ultimate aim of our work, and I think of everyone committed to this. As I've said, we value and need in-house expertise and support from HE institutions on research and evaluation, so I'm really keen to speak to you today, as I know you focus on sort of institutional research as well as planning. And I guess that's a final question. If you want, maybe you want to throw it back at me, how I could better engage with those planning in HE to ensure that it includes evaluation of access, participation, and student outcomes.
Thank you very much indeed, Omar. That was a really interesting overview of the work of TASO, and it's great to finish on a call to action about how can we work better with you as an IR community. And I think there's a lot of questions in there. There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Hold on. Yeah, I've got it. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say there's a couple of questions in the chat, which we've got a couple of minutes left for some questions, but I'm sure that colleagues could contact you directly if they have any specific questions about TASO's work. There's a question in there from Maurizio, which asks the question: are there any plans to publish some guidance around qualitative evaluation from TASO? Yes,
I mean, it's a good question. There is some within the ethics guidance. The ethics guidance covers both how to conduct RCTs in an ethical way, because there are issues around how you randomize, when you can and can't randomize. But there is in that guidance, yes, we have covered qualitative research in there. It's not guidance on how to conduct qualitative research. It's guidance on ethics. And I think you probably would need to go elsewhere for that. But we do, I'm trying to think some of our webinars. I mean, we do webinars on theories of change, for example. I think that's key, whether or not you're doing quantitative or qualitative. I mean, I think it's one of the questions even about the summer schools, right? What is it that we're trying to achieve in doing these activities? Are we trying to reach actually the most disadvantaged? Or actually, is it fine to reach someone who's quite close to applying, but we really want to nudge them over the line? So if your theory of change is actually this intervention is targeted on, a population who are 80 to 90% likely to attend, but we're really worried that they might not put their name in at the end of the day, then maybe a summer school is the right intervention. But if your theory of change is we need an intervention to support students who are young people who are really far from university, then maybe summer schools are not very well designed at the moment. So we have produced some webinars on how to produce a good theory of change, which I think whether or not you're doing qualitative or quantitative evaluation is necessary to determine whether or not the intervention was effective. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, obviously, and if you don't know the steps, the intermediate outcomes, that might help you achieve that, then I think it's not going to be a very good evaluation, and the intervention is less likely to be successful.
Thank you. And you mentioned ethics before, and the other question that's in the chat is around about how how to work around the kind of requirement, this kind of strict requirements of a research ethics committee. And I speak here as a former chair of a university research ethics committee grappling with these issues about institutional research. So if you can say a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I do think it varies a lot by institution, and I probably am a little uncomfortable advocating bypassing research ethics committees, especially as you were a former chair of a research, but I am generally also a little bit. I do think some activities do need to go through research ethics, obviously, especially when you're dealing with students, and I think universities are going to be understandably uncomfortable of not doing an ethics where you're dealing with research subjects and students in your university. I do think, though, that there are evaluation activities that don't require ethical, well, they require ethical consideration. You absolutely, so that the question is not, do you need to consider ethics? The question is whether or not you need to go through the institutional ethics committee as designed in your institution. I can't answer that question. I think there are cases where you will not need to, but I think even in those cases, it's probably worth talking about it with your managers, or even maybe there needs to be a bigger conversation here with those research ethics committees and WP teams and an institutional by institution basis to get that right.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. There's another question in the chat that you might want to reply to in the chat rather than online. But I just want to thank you very much for your contribution today on behalf of both the HEIR planning group and also the delegates on the call. And I'll now pass on to Phil Gravestock, another member of the HEIR planning group, for the next session by Paul Ashwin from Lancaster University. Thank you very much again, Omar, and over to you.